Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story. Missouri has a message for China, pay up to the tune of $24 billion, or the state will move to seize Chinese assets and farmlands within its bounds. All that after winning a lawsuit against the country for its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Chinese tariffs are hitting American farmers starting today. A look at what products will feel the effects. Social media platform X removing thousands of accounts with suspected ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Why these accounts have been going after an American dance company. And President Trump is setting up a White House office to resurrect the American shipbuilding industry. More details on the urgency for building ships at home.
But the most dangerous is the Chinese Communist Party's effective control of the terms of trade. They dominate the shipping and the shipbuilding industry.
Before we dive into today's top story, we'd like to share an important update. You can now catch China in Focus on Genjing World every Tuesday instead of YouTube. We'll publish the link in the description box down below at that time, or you can search China in Focus at genjingworld.com. The Attorney General for the state of Missouri just won a $24 billion lawsuit against the Chinese Communist regime. The Friday verdict comes after Chinese representatives failed to show up in court. What's the case all about and what will happen next? Let's dive in.
The case made some major accusations, including that the Chinese regime caused and worsened the COVID-19 pandemic by concealing critical information early on, and secondly, obstructing the production and exports of key medical supplies during the pandemic. Reports and witnesses citing the lawsuit say that China first knew of COVID-19 patients in fall 2019. The southern city of Wuhan is where first cases of COVID-19 were found. According to frontline Chinese doctors, in November 2019, the situation was so bad in Wuhan that high schools had to cancel classes. But due to Beijing's strict censorship, the World Health Organization did not know about it until a month later. And while the rest of the world was still in the dark about COVID-19, China imported 16 times more medical masks than usual from the U.S. alone, based on trade data from early 2020. The lawsuit described China's behavior as a, quote, aggressive campaign to hoard and monopolize medical supplies. Now, federal court has ruled those statements valid, deciding that China owes Missouri over $24 billion plus interest. State health data shows over 21,000 Missouri residents died after getting infected by COVID-19 from 2020 to 2021. That makes the virus the third leading cause of death in Missouri during that time. The lawsuit targets 9 defendants, including the Chinese Communist Party, China's top health body, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which many believe is the source of the virus leak that caused the pandemic. Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey had a message for China after winning the case, saying, quote, pay up or we start seizing assets and farmland. According to Missouri's Agriculture Department, China owns over 42,000 acres of farmland in the state as of last August, the most of any foreign nation. Currently, China does not own any land near Missouri's 2 military installations. Back to the ruling, although it's unclear how the enforcement will play out, Missouri says it can seize China's assets within the state to make up the debt. The Attorney General's office said it may seek assistance from the Trump administration moving forward. According to a statement to the New York Times, a spokesperson for China's embassy in the U.S. dismissed the ruling and threatened retaliation. Flora Hua, NTD News.
The Chinese regime retaliating against U.S. tariffs by imposing a new round of its own, this time on certain U.S. agricultural goods. President Trump says his trade policies will make the U.S. richer in the end. Here's the latest on escalating trade tensions.
In trade, as in hockey, Canada will win.
Some American trade partners are cracking down on U.S. exports. Starting today, American farmers face new retaliatory tariffs on many products they send to China. The measures include an extra 15% duty on chicken, wheat, corn, and cotton, and a 10% one on items such as beef and soybeans. Some American farmers say they're worried escalating trade tensions could make it harder to sell their products abroad.
Everything we produce far exceeds what the domestic market could handle.
Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's newly elected successor is standing by Canada's retaliation against the U.S.
And my government will keep our tariffs on until the Americans show us respect.
President Donald Trump is doubling down. He says some tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods scheduled for April 2nd, quote, could go up. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick says duties on steel and aluminum imports are set to start Wednesday.
China also announced tariffs on certain Canadian farm and food imports Saturday, including an additional 100% tariffs on rapeseed oil, oil cakes, and peas, plus an additional 25% tariffs on pork and aquatic products. That's to retaliate against Canadian tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles, steel, and aluminum products imposed in October. The fresh duties are set to take effect next Thursday. Analysts say China's decision could serve as a warning to Ottawa to not align too closely with the U.S., especially on fentanyl. An army of ex-accounts with suspected ties to the Chinese Communist Party just got taken down by the social media platform. The accounts had been flooding the social media site with reports of New York Times articles aimed at painting classical Chinese dance company Shen Performing Arts in a negative light. The American, New York-based dance company seeks to showcase China before communism, and for that reason cannot perform inside China. The ex-accounts that were removed had no indication of being authentic users.
The New York Times was writing hit pieces on Shen Performing Arts, New York-based performing arts company. The CCP's targeting them. They got targeted with bomb threats, death threats. New York Times is not covering that. Instead, they're using these hit pieces, targeting Shen Yun, doing the exact thing the CCP wants, and then Chinese Communist Party linked accounts are promoting the New York Times articles.
X removed most of the spam accounts after the Epoch Times conducted an investigation. According to BuzzSumo data, the operation pushed one of the hit pieces to become the most shared New York Times article on X for the past year. But why is the CCP going this far to target an American dance company? Touring in theaters around the globe, Shen Yun was founded by Falun Gong practitioners who fled persecution in mainland China. The group faces imprisonment and severe torture by the CCP authorities. State Department reports suggest many of them had their organs forcibly harvested to supply the regime's transplant market. Last year, multiple CCP whistleblowers warned that China has launched a new campaign seeking to eliminate Falun Gong overseas. The tactics include mobilizing Western news outlets and social influencers to pit Americans against the spiritual group. In a statement to the Epoch Times, X says, quote, "We take reports like these very seriously."
Next, we pivot from reports about modern-day communist China to a revival of ancient China's 5,000-year history. That's the mission of classical Chinese dance company Shen Performing Arts. And right now, the group's 8 individual touring companies are traveling around the world simultaneously. We spoke to audience members about their reflections on the performance. NTD is a proud sponsor of Shen. Watch. Tim Coney is a production sound mixer that has received Oscar and Emmy nominations. He said Shen Yun's musicians are top-notch.
You can't beat live music, and these guys really knew what they were doing. You can tell that they played that song before, you know, I mean, it was very professional, and it adds excitement to the show. The way they play those instruments and the way the music sounded, it really enhanced the show.
Frank Ricciazzi is a real estate investor. He said Shen Yun's performance touches the soul.
I got the feeling of there's a divinity, and there's a beautiful spiritual to what our lives are. It's our heart. And that heart was given to us by that person, that spiritual up above.
Terry Coyle, a doctor, said the performance helped him correct a stereotype.
We always have this stereotype of the Chinese people being the communistic party, but it's different. The Communistic Party is unfortunately the hammer and the sickle that keeps the people oppressed. And it was nice to see that the oppressed people are still looking for the divine power, looking for the divine leader. And it was just beautiful.
Audiences in New York City can see Shen Yun this season starting March 26th. President Trump pledging to resurrect the American shipbuilding industry. He said, "We're going to make ships very fast and very soon." This as China is surpassing the U.S. in the number of warships. NTD's Kerry Dunst spoke with Brent Sadler for Insight. He's a former Pentagon official.
Good morning, Brent. Thanks for joining. Trump's announcement for the creation of an Office of Shipbuilding seems a bit unusual within the White House and not the Department of Defense. Why do you think he feels the White House needs to be directly involved?
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is big news for those in the maritime industry, navalists, and folks in the shipping and shipbuilding industry. And it's not that unique. There have been in the past offices similarly tasked to revitalize the nation's strategically important maritime industry. The most significant was back in the mid-30s, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood up a similar kind of maritime office in SAR to coordinate an industrial expansion in time to build the ships, like Liberty ships, that actually carried the day in World War II. This current office in the White House is important because you do have various agencies scattered across the federal government that all have a hand in the maritime industrial base or the nation's maritime interests, like fishing. So these over 5 different agencies and departments need to be coordinated. And again, this is a presidential level interest item. If you go back to his campaigns, the reindustrialization of the nation is something that President Trump is very interested about. And one of the best ways to do it and get the biggest bang or return on investment is through the shipping industry.
Why the urgency now to build ships at home?
Yeah, the number one driver of this is there's been an awareness, unfortunately, thanks to the various crises that we've seen over the last 4 years, and some of them, accidents, human error, like the ship that grounded in the Suez Canal. If you remember several years ago, that basically had a snafu on global shipping. And of course, recovery from COVID also with the backlogs at many of our ports and their supply chain problems. But the most dangerous is the Chinese Communist Party's effective control of the terms of trade. They have strategically, over the last 20 plus years, leveraged their position in strategic ports across the world. They dominate the shipping and the shipbuilding industry. So this is actually very dangerous and puts the United States in a precarious situation because it has very few, less than 80 ships that are flagged and manned by U.S. personnel can rely on shipping. The nation had 80,000 ship visits to keep its economy humming before.
Now, to hone deeper into China, just speaking on shipbuilding, they're the fastest growing shipbuilder in the world. Can the U.S. catch up?
It's not a question of catching up. I mean, the first step is that we need to find out what is the minimum global market share the United States commercial industry needs to have so that it can sustain our economy in a crisis or in a conflict with China. That also includes the ability to build and to sustain, repair the Navy that we would need to have, ideally, to deter a war, but if need be able to fight it to conclusion.
Now, panning away from China, it's implied by Trump that these ships are, as you just discussed, for our Navy and other military branches. Are these ships also intended for other customers that we would build?
When we're talking about the domestic and commercial industry, those would be for anyone, any customer, but pretty much the last 40 years or so, the only customer for U.S. built ships has been the U.S. federal government. And so we have to get away from that. We have to start finding a way to leverage America's comparative advantages and then trying to make a differentiated maritime product, a new type of ship. One of these potentials is in small modular nuclear reactors to allow large container ships to steam at high speed so that you can move cargo faster, needing less ships, and also at zero carbon emissions at sea to meet international energy requirements.
Interesting. Using electric seems very innovative. Now, we've discussed the strategy on why we need to start building ships. Can you share, as we conclude, how and by whom the ships will get built?
Well, I think it's going to take a lot of involvement by our closest allies. Japan and South Korea at one point in time were both dominant shipbuilders themselves, and they currently rank in the top 3. China's the lead. And so we're going to have to leverage our treaty allies that share a common strategic and national security interest as us. So clearly attracting capital investment from such allies into the United States is going to be key. We saw some of this is already happening with South Korean companies buying into Philadelphia shipyard. And we'll watch that very closely to see how it progresses.
Well, we appreciate your joining us this morning, sharing your insights on this very timely topic. Brent Sadler, Naval Warfare Research Fellow. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, TikTok could soon get a new owner. President Trump said his administration is in touch with 4 different groups about the app's potential sale to a U.S. entity, with even more possible buyers on the horizon. And U.S. Treasury Scott Bessent said President Trump is confident that Beijing won't dare invade Taiwan during his time in office. NTD's Taiwan correspondent Joy Chu has more on the story. Chinese and Russian naval forces are flexing muscle in Iran, holding joint drills in the Gulf state. But President Trump has to say on the alliance.
Russia, China, and Iran are doing military exercises together. Does that concern you?
No, not at all. Not at all.
More on that after the break here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Will Chinese-owned social media TikTok get ousted from the U.S., or does it have a future on American soil? President Trump said his administration was in touch with 4 different groups about the sale of TikTok to a U.S. entity. If the app successfully parts ways with its Chinese parent company, TikTok could continue on in America, but under a new owner. Here's a closer look.
Donald Trump says a deal to sell TikTok could be close. Speaking to journalists on Air Force One on Sunday, he said there was a lot of interest.
Sir, do you think there's going to be a deal on TikTok soon?
There could be. We're dealing with 4 different groups, and a lot of people want it, and it's up to me. So there could be.
TikTok owner ByteDance had faced a January deadline to sell the app or shut down in the US. The previous US administration had viewed the Chinese app as a national security risk, as did Trump in his first term. But he has since revised his position and, on returning to office, signed an executive order delaying the ban by 75 days. Trump subsequently floated the idea of selling it to parties including Elon Musk, his ally in government cost-cutting efforts. He has also suggested that the US should get a stake in the app, which analysts value at up to $50 billion. Speaking last week, Trump said the 75-day deadline could be extended if more time is needed to do a deal.
I think, look, we have a lot of interest in TikTok, and China is going to play a role. And so hopefully China will approve of the deal, but they're going to play a role. But we have a lot of interest in TikTok.
On Monday, the identity of the 4 interested groups mentioned by Trump wasn't clear. Among those to recently express an interest is former Los Angeles Dodgers owner Frank McCourt. There was no immediate comment on Trump's claims from TikTok or ByteDance.
Turning now to Taiwan, U.S. intelligence officials have warned that the Chinese Communist Party could invade Taiwan by 2027. But the Secretary of the Treasury says President Trump is confident China will not take such action during his presidency. NTD's Taiwan correspondent Joy Chu has more.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says President Trump is confident Chinese leader Xi Jinping will not attack Taiwan during his time in the White House. President Trump's nominee for Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby, said during his Senate confirmation hearing last week that Taiwan's fall to China would be a disaster for American interest. He also emphasized the need for Taiwan to increase its defense spending.
I think actually as a proportion of GDP, it's well below 3%. I agree with President Trump that they should be more like 10%, or at least something in that ballpark, really focused on their defense.
U.S. intelligence officials have said that the People's Liberation Army is preparing to invade Taiwan by 2027, but stressed this is not a deadline for war. Admiral Samuel Paparo, head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, said last month the exercises around Taiwan were no longer just training, but the rehearsal. Reporting from Taiwan, Joy Chu, NTD News.
Chinese and Russian naval vessels held a joint exercise in Iran on Monday. The naval exercise was held near an Iranian port in the Gulf of Oman. U.S. President Trump reacted to it.
The Maritime Security Belt 2025 drills aim to strengthen military ties between the three nations. The countries want to counterbalance U.S. influence and challenge the Western-led global order. They were said to include simulated strikes on maritime targets and search and rescue drills. Iran has sent a stealth missile corvette and a patrol ship, according to Iranian state media. Asked yesterday by reporters about the Russia-China joint drill, President Trump said he is not concerned.
Russia, China, and Iran are doing military exercises together. Does that concern you?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Why not?
Because we're stronger than all of them. We have more power than all of them.
Now over to India, where the Tibetan Youth Congress held a protest outside the Chinese embassy in the Indian capital, New Delhi, on Monday. The group condemned the Chinese regime's ongoing cultural genocide in Tibet.
We are against the genocide of the Tibetan people in the Tibetan Autonomous Area in Tibet. We are against the cultural deterioration. We are against the Chinese propaganda schooling of the Tibetan children, in which millions of Tibetan children are being studied, are being forced to study the Chinese propaganda. We are against the human rights violations in the Tibet.
The protest coincides with the 66th anniversary of the 1959 Tibetan uprising, which was against the occupation of the Tibet region by Mao Zedong's People's Liberation Army. After the uprising failed, many Tibetans, along with their spiritual leader, fled to India and took refuge. Since then, Tibetans have run a government in exile from a North India hill town and advocate for Tibet's autonomy using peaceful means. In Dharamshala, Tibetans held an official ceremony without incident.
And now we turn to real estate in China. Bad news for Evergrande, the world's most heavily indebted property developer with $300 billion in debt as of last year. A subsidiary of the company, China's Evergrande Property Services Group, said on Friday it could see an up to 37% drop in its annual profit for 2024. Let's dive in.
The decline is due to legal expenses, among other reasons. Evergrande Property began legal proceedings against its parent. In early January, a Guangzhou court in China ordered Evergrande to repay $1.85 billion owed to its subsidiary. Evergrande Property expects to lose a record loss of up to $80 million in profit.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.